In March 1941, a new German commander stepped onto North African sand with a big reputation and an even bigger assumption: the British would crack the moment he hit them hard. His name was Erwin Rommel, and up to that point, he'd been the kind of general people whispered about. Fast, aggressive, always moving. In Europe, his units had smashed through defenses and raced forward so quickly that even his own side sometimes worried he was going too far, too fast. Now he had fresh orders: rush into Libya, stabilize Italy's collapsing position, and turn the whole campaign around. Rommel looked at the map and saw an opportunity. He figured the British in Egypt would be methodical and predictable, like they'd been in earlier campaigns, tied to fixed lines, cautious, and slow to react. And in a normal place, that would have been a fair bet. But North Africa wasn't a normal place. The desert didn't care what you learned in a classroom. It didn't care about neat battle plans, strong-looking arrows on a map, or textbook formations. In the Western Desert, your biggest enemy could be the ground under your tracks. The terrain was huge and empty: rock, sand, low scrub, and almost nothing else. No towns every few miles, no forests to hide behind, no rivers to anchor a line. Just open space that went on forever. Days could burn you alive. Nights could freeze you. Sand found its way into everything: engines, weapons, radios, even your mouth when you tried to sleep. Vehicles broke down constantly. Air filters clogged. Tracks snapped. Tires shredded. And if you got lost out there, you didn't just take a wrong turn. You could vanish. Water wasn't just important. It was life. Fuel was almost as valuable, and the deeper you pushed forward, the longer and weaker your supply line became. In the desert, every mile of success could quietly turn into a trap. Rommel arrived confident anyway. At first, it even looked like he was right. His forces pushed east, retaking ground the Italians had lost. The movement felt unstoppable, like a wave rolling forward. And then, strange reports started coming in. German reconnaissance units spotted British tanks appearing like they'd popped out of the ground. They'd strike fast, hit hard, and then disappear into the open desert before the Germans could respond. British columns that should have been retreating weren't running at all. They were looping around, showing up on flanks that were supposed to be safe. Supply convoys were getting jumped in areas German intelligence had marked as empty. That's when the mood changed, because this didn't feel like a normal enemy. It felt like being watched. Rommel demanded answers. Who was doing this? Which unit was moving like that out here? So bold, so confident, like the desert belonged to them. The identification came from a mix of captured men, recovered gear, and a symbol that kept showing up: a red desert rat on a white background. This wasn't just British armor. This was the British 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. And they had been fighting in this wasteland since 1940, long before Rommel ever arrived. While German soldiers were learning warfare in Europe: roads, villages, fences, clear objectives. These guys were learning something else: how to survive the desert, how to move in it, and how to make it work like a weapon. If you want to understand why German soldiers came to fear the Desert Rats more than any other British unit in North Africa, you have to understand the real battlefield first, not the map. The environment. The desert was a place where traditional advantages could evaporate. A better tank didn't matter much if it broke down. A perfect plan didn't matter if it depended on roads that weren't there. And a bold advance didn't matter if your fuel trucks got hit and your men ran out of water. German forces coming in during 1941 were battle-hardened, no doubt, but they were used to structure. Even in fast-moving warfare, Europe still gave you reference points: rail lines, bridges, cities, forests, intersections. In the Western Desert, you could spin your vehicle around in a slow circle and see nothing. That nothing messed with people. Navigation was brutal. Landmarks were rare. A unit could drive too far the wrong direction and not realize it until it was already in trouble. And if you didn't know where the enemy was, you also didn't know where safety was. The Desert Rats didn't see the desert as empty. They saw it like a living map. They knew where the ground dipped low enough to hide vehicles. They knew what looked impassable but wasn't. They learned how to use shallow depressions to protect a tank's hull while still firing. They learned routes that weren't obvious from a distance. That kind of knowledge was worth more than a fancy weapon, because it let them decide when and where a fight happened. And that was the second reason Germans feared them. The Desert Rats didn't fight the way German commanders expected the British to fight. Earlier in the war, German officers had watched British forces operate in a more rigid way. Defend a position, hold it, wait for orders, respond slowly. Germany's doctrine depended on the opposite: speed, initiative, and forcing the enemy to react. The goal was to unbalance the opponent before they could settle into a plan. But the 7th Armored Division didn't sit still long enough to get unbalanced. They moved like hunters. Small groups, fast strikes, quick withdrawals, constant probing. They hit isolated positions, then vanished before German units could mass up and crush them. They drove long distances, including at night, using basic navigation skills and desert experience. And at dawn, German patrols would wake up and realize British armor was operating somewhere it shouldn't be, on a flank, behind a screen, or near a supply route that was supposed to be safe. This wasn't just courage, it was a method, and it was infuriating for the Germans because it forced them to waste time and fuel reacting. If you're enjoying this kind of World War II storytelling, tight, true, and straight to the point, tap the subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter of the Desert Rats War. Now, one of the smartest things the Desert Rats developed was a style of fighting built for this exact environment: independent, flexible, and fast. Instead of one big armored fist moving as a single block, they used smaller combined groups that could operate on their own. Tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, mixed together in mobile packages. They could scout, fight, and withdraw without needing permission for every move. In the desert, that independence was deadly because battles weren't always set-piece. Sometimes you'd get a sudden clash, a rapid shift, a chance to hit an exposed convoy. Then the chance vanished as fast as it appeared. A unit that had to wait for orders could lose the moment. The Desert Rats didn't wait. They could exploit a mistake instantly. The Germans, trained to fight as cohesive formations, found themselves facing something that felt like it was everywhere and nowhere. Outposts got raided, patrols disappeared, convoys got hit, and the attackers melted back into open land like smoke. To the men on the ground, it didn't feel like a clean fight. It felt like being hunted by an enemy that didn't play by the same rules. And that leads to the third reason the Desert Rats scared them: patience. German doctrine, especially the way Rommel liked to fight, leaned hard on decisive action. Concentrate your strength. Hit hard. Break through. Keep moving. Don't give the enemy time to recover. That works when your opponent stands and fights on your terms. But the Desert Rats refused to be destroyed. When German forces attacked in strength, the Desert Rats often didn't stay put and die in place. They withdrew and dispersed. They vanished into the desert rather than give the Germans a neat battle where superior concentration could crush them. German tanks would roll into positions expecting a big fight and find empty ground and abandoned camps. And in war, when your enemy disappears, your brain tries to label it cowardice, weakness, panic. That assumption was a mistake, because the moment German units stretched out, when their advance outran their supplies, when fuel became an issue, when isolated elements separated from support, that's when the Desert Rats would come back. They didn't need to win a huge battle every time. They needed to make German victories expensive. They hit fuel convoys. They jumped isolated companies. They forced German units to burn time and resources protecting logistics instead of pushing forward. In the desert, logistics were the spine of an army, and the Desert Rats made it their business to attack that spine. That kind of warfare is exhausting. It grinds you down. It makes you feel like you can never relax. Like every stop is dangerous. Like every move is visible. And German soldiers started to absorb that fear, slowly and steadily. Not just fear of dying, fear of being worn out, of being stranded, of running out of water, of having your engine die at the wrong moment, with British tanks somewhere beyond the horizon. The Desert Rats understood attrition in a way that messed with German expectations. They traded space for time. They accepted retreats if it kept the unit alive. They came back again and again, even after setbacks. That resilience hit Germans psychologically, because plenty of armies can fight well when things go their way. But the Desert Rats fought like they expected hardship and had already made peace with it. German medics and guards who dealt with captured Desert Rats noticed something odd. Many of them didn't act broken. Even as prisoners, they could seem calm, even joking with each other. Not because they didn't care, but because they had a culture built around endurance. This division had spent months living in brutal conditions. They were far from home, far from comfort, and often operating with limited support. They learned to rely on each other because in the desert, you couldn't fake teamwork. If your buddy's vehicle broke down, you didn't shrug and move on. You stripped parts, shared water, and got him moving because next time it might be you. That cohesion showed in small things. Crews working almost wordlessly, men repairing equipment with whatever they could find, officers sharing the same dust and thirst as everyone else. And always that symbol, stitched on, painted on, carried with pride, the red desert rat. Rommel recognized what he was dealing with. He wasn't facing a soft enemy. He was facing a unit that had adapted to the desert so well that it could make a modern army feel clumsy. That's why he began adjusting his own approach, pushing reconnaissance farther forward, watching his flanks more carefully, and warning his officers not to assume the Desert Rats would behave like other British formations, because the Desert Rats didn't hold positions just because a map said they should. They didn't attack where you were strongest just to prove they were brave. They looked for weakness. They waited for errors. They used the desert to blur the battlefield until German planning felt shaky. And the officers who ignored that reality paid for it. More than once, German units advanced correctly in neat formations, confident in their superior strength, only to find themselves outmaneuvered, losing vehicles and men to a force that seemed smaller but smarter in that environment. By mid-1941, the Desert Rats weren't just a problem, they were a pattern, a constant pressure, a threat that never fully went away. And soon, that pressure would tighten around a place that mattered more than almost anything in the whole campaign, a port city that Rommel needed but couldn't afford to waste time on. Tobruk. Tobruk wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a port, one of the few places on that coastline where supplies could come in close to the front. And in North Africa, supplies were everything. Food, fuel, water, ammunition, spare parts. Without them, tanks became metal statues and soldiers became stranded people in a hostile world. In early 1941, Rommel's rapid push across Cyrenaica shoved the British back hard. The momentum was real, the pressure was constant, and it looked like the kind of offensive that could keep rolling all the way toward Egypt if nothing stopped it. But Tobruk stopped it. The defenders inside the perimeter, Australian and British troops, refused to fold. They dug in, held on, and turned the port into a stubborn fortress Rommel couldn't just ignore. And here's the part that drove the Germans crazy. The Desert Rats weren't stuck inside Tobruk. They were outside it, operating in open desert. That meant every time Rommel tried to tighten the noose, he had to worry about a mobile British armored force prowling around his rear areas, while some of his units were focused on the city itself. The Desert Rats were hitting the parts of his army that couldn't be protected by courage alone, his supply lines and isolated positions. They raided transport columns. They ambushed reinforcement movements. They jumped small outposts at the worst possible times, often at night or in the early morning when men were exhausted and visibility was low. Tobruk became a siege, but it was also a constant chase. Rommel wanted a clean, decisive victory. A sharp punch that breaks the enemy and frees him to push east. Instead, he got a slow grind month after month, where every step forward had a cost, and every pause was dangerous. The longer Tobruk held, the more it forced Rommel into the thing the desert punished the most: stretched logistics. To keep pressure on the city and still keep an offensive threat toward Egypt, he had to keep men, vehicles, and fuel flowing across long distances of desert. That meant trucks traveling exposed routes, guarded convoys, constant maintenance, constant risk. And the Desert Rats understood the logic of it better than anyone. They didn't need to smash Rommel's spearhead head-on. They needed to dull it. They turned the desert into a place where German strength bled out in little pieces. One fuel truck here, one disabled vehicle there, one outpost overrun, one patrol that didn't come back. From the perspective of a German soldier, it didn't always feel like battle. It felt like stress, heat, thirst, dust, flies, broken sleep, and then the sudden crack of violence, an ambush, artillery fire, tanks appearing on a flank, followed by the worst part of all, not being able to strike back cleanly, because the Desert Rats would hit and vanish again. That's how the nickname Rats really dug in. German troops used it like an insult, like they were dealing with pests, something that kept crawling back no matter how hard you tried to stamp it out. But the British already wore the name like a badge. And out there, it fit perfectly, because the desert rats didn't frontally charge into a killing zone just to look heroic. They fought like they were playing a long game where survival and patience beat drama. For Rommel, Tobruk became the constant thorn that ruined the perfect rhythm of his offensive. He couldn't fully commit to one big decisive strike toward Egypt, while this port sat behind his forward elements, still alive, still resisting, still threatening his lifeline. So month after month, Tobruk held. About 8 months of pressure, frustration, and constant losses. Losses that didn't always show up as one huge disaster, but as 1,000 cuts that wore down the Afrika Korps. Supplies dwindled, vehicles broke, men wore out, and always, somewhere out in the open desert, the desert rats were watching. That psychological part mattered more than people think. In Europe, a soldier could usually point to something and say, "That's the front." A town, a river, a line of trees, a ridge. In the western desert, the front could be wherever you were. That meant you never fully relaxed, you never felt safe. Even if you weren't in immediate combat, you were always exposed to the possibility that British armor could appear out of the haze, strike, and disappear again. German soldiers started to feel like they were the visitors, like they'd walked into someone else's territory, because the desert rats moved like locals, like the environment was on their side. Rommel understood this better than most, and he didn't treat the 7th Armored Division casually. He studied them, he adjusted around them. He pushed reconnaissance farther forward, tried to read their patterns, tried to anticipate where they'd cut in next. He also warned his officers, do not expect these men to behave like British units you met in France. The desert rats would not hold ground that couldn't be held. They would not attack where you were strongest. They would find weakness first, often before you even realized it was there. This warning wasn't a polite suggestion. It was survival advice, because German units that assumed standard British behavior ran into a nightmare. They advanced in clean formations and discovered the battle was happening somewhere else. They guarded one route and lost another. They massed for a strike and found the enemy had melted away, only to be hit later when their fuel was low and their columns were scattered. To some German commanders, this felt like unfair fighting. To the desert rats, it was simply smart. The desert punished pride. If you got stubborn and demanded a decisive showdown every time, the desert would bleed you out. And the desert rats had learned that lesson early. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were trying to win. That brings us to one of the strangest parts of why German troops feared them. It wasn't only their aggression, it was their refusal to emotionally collapse. Units can look tough on paper and still break when conditions get rough. The desert rats had been dealing with rough conditions for so long that hardship was almost the baseline. After retreats that would humiliate other formations, they came back and attacked again. After defeats that could wreck morale, they reorganized, repaired, and returned. Even when numbers were reduced and equipment was worn down, the division kept functioning. And when Germans captured desert rats, many of those prisoners didn't act defeated the way their captors expected. They could be calm, sometimes even joking, asking for a cigarette, acting like they'd be back in a tank soon enough. That wasn't magic, it was identity. This division had built a culture in isolation, far from home, in a harsh environment where daily survival depended on teamwork and stubbornness more than speeches. The Germans noticed the details: crews moving with smooth coordination, men cannibalizing broken vehicles to keep the rest running, officers sharing the dust and heat without acting like they were above it. And that symbol, the red rat, showed pride, a quiet confidence that said, "We belong here." Rommel's campaign was now defined by an ongoing duel, his push for decisive results versus the desert rat's patience, mobility, and constant harassment. Each side learned from the other. Rommel tried using more aggressive reconnaissance and flanking moves to counter British maneuvering. The desert rats adjusted right back, refusing to be pinned, refusing to be predictable. And while Tobruk kept holding, the campaign's rhythm changed. Because Rommel could win tactical fights, he could take ground, force retreats, score dramatic advances, but he kept running into the same wall. You can't eat sand. You can't drive a tank without fuel. You can't push an army forward on bravery alone. The desert rats kept turning those facts into weapons. They forced the Germans to protect convoys, guard routes, and spend time doing things that didn't look glorious, but were necessary to avoid collapse. And that's when German respect started sharpening into something else, not hate in a loud, emotional way, more like a hard, simmering frustration at an enemy that wouldn't cooperate with your plans, an enemy that refused to break, an enemy that kept coming back. By late 1942, the balance of the whole campaign would begin shifting. British leadership changed, supplies grew, the Desert War started moving toward a phase where big, planned battles mattered again. And when that moment came, when the fighting tightened into a clash that would decide the campaign, the Desert Rat's reputation walked onto the battlefield before they did, because German units knew what it meant when that red rat patch was in the area. It meant no rest, no easy flanks, no safe desert behind you. And next, that reputation would collide with a set-piece battle that finally forced both sides into a different kind of fight. El Alamein. By late 1942, the Desert War started to change shape. For a long time, North Africa had felt like a giant moving chessboard. Wide space, sudden raids, long flanking drives, and battles that could flare up and disappear before most people even understood what had happened. But now the conditions were shifting. The British were no longer operating on fumes and improvisation alone. Leadership was reorganized, supplies increased, the Allies were better supported than they had been earlier in the campaign. And when you have fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and food actually flowing the way an army needs it to flow, you can do something the desert usually makes difficult. You can plan a bigger, more deliberate fight. That's where El Alamein comes in. El Alamein wasn't like the free-roaming desert battles where units could drift for miles and vanish into open space. Geography narrowed the battlefield. Movement was more constrained. The fighting leaned more toward a set-piece clash, where preparation, logistics, and sustained pressure mattered as much as surprise. And yet, even as the war shifted, the Desert Rats still carried the reputation they'd built over 2 brutal years, the unit that would not go away. So German soldiers had faced different British formations across the campaign. Some fought hard and then withdrew. Some were stubborn in defense. Some were cautious. But the 7th Armored Division had become something else in German minds. Not the best equipped, not the biggest, just the most relentless. They were the enemy that would circle back, the enemy that would reappear, the enemy that could lose ground today and still hit you tomorrow. That kind of reputation doesn't come from one heroic moment. It comes from repetition over and over under the worst conditions. At El Alamein, the Desert Rats fought as part of a larger effort that finally had the weight to break the Axis position in North Africa. The victory didn't belong to one unit alone. This was a massive Allied push, but the Desert Rats were right there in the thick of it, doing what they had always done, keeping pressure, finding openings, staying in the fight. And when the Axis line finally cracked, the Desert War entered its next stage, the chase. The pursuit across Libya was more than a retreat on a map. It was a reversal of psychology. For months, Rommel's forces had advanced with confidence, forcing the British back, trying to turn movement into victory. Now German units were the ones falling back, often under constant pressure, with stretched logistics, damaged vehicles, and a growing sense that the desert had turned against them. The Desert Rats had spent the early phase of the campaign learning how to survive in this environment. Now, in the pursuit, they showed they had learned how to dominate it too. This is the part people sometimes miss. The Desert Rats weren't famous because they always won. They didn't. North Africa was full of reversals. There were defeats and retreats, and moments where the situation looked bleak. They became feared because they stayed functional through all of it. In the pursuit, that mattered, because a retreating army is vulnerable in a way an advancing army often isn't. Its columns can stretch out, units become isolated, supplies are harder to organize, repair work becomes desperate, decisions get rushed, and every mistake becomes a chance for the enemy to strike. The Desert Rats were built to exploit that. They didn't need the Germans to make a giant blunder. A small slip was enough. A convoy lagging behind, a route that wasn't secured, a unit that paused too long, a fuel shortage that forced a stop in the wrong spot. In the desert, stopping at the wrong time can be the beginning of disaster. So as the Axis forces pulled back across ground they'd once taken so confidently, the Desert Rats' pressure became a kind of final proof. This division wasn't just an early war desert oddity, it was one of the formations that had truly adapted. By the time the fighting pushed into Tunisia and the Axis position collapsed in May 1943, German veterans carried a consistent memory of the 7th Armored Division, one that showed up again and again in post-war interviews and accounts. They were hard to predict, hard to pin down, hard to exhaust, and almost impossible to psychologically break. And here's something important. Fear doesn't always mean hatred. In many cases, what German soldiers felt toward the Desert Rats was a rough, reluctant respect. Not because the Desert Rats were brutal or cruel, they weren't known for that as a defining trait, but because they were effective. They did things correctly for the desert. They moved intelligently. They protected their cohesion. They hit where it hurt. They survived setbacks that would have shattered other units. That kind of enemy is terrifying because it's not about luck. It's about competence. By the end of the campaign, the Desert Rats had become a symbol. The red rat patch wasn't just unit identification anymore. It meant something. It meant you were dealing with soldiers who understood this battlefield. And that's why German commanders made a mistake early on, one they later recognized too late. They assumed British forces would fight the same way they had earlier in the war. Cautious, rigid, tied down, easy to unbalance with speed and initiative. But the Desert Rats didn't fit that template. They fought with mobility and deception. They used distance as protection. They treated the desert like terrain, not emptiness. They knew how to trade space for time without losing their identity. They understood that the real prize wasn't always ground. It was the enemy's ability to keep operating. And that last part is key. The Desert Rats didn't need to win every tank duel. They needed to stay alive long enough to keep forcing the Afrika Korps to spend fuel, spend time, spend energy. That is how a theoretically superior force can lose a campaign even while winning individual engagements. The desert is an accountant. It adds up every mile, every repair, every fuel truck, every hour of engine wear, every water ration. If you waste resources, the desert collects payment. The Desert Rats learned to make the Germans pay. They made the war expensive, and over time, that cost shaped the campaign's outcome. After North Africa, the 7th Armored Division went on to fight in other theaters, Italy, then Northwest Europe. By then, their reputation traveled ahead of them. German units who later encountered the Desert Rats in places like Normandy or the Low Countries were not meeting some unknown British formation. They were meeting a unit with a history, and the qualities that made them feared in Africa weren't just desert tricks. The deeper trait carried over, endurance and adaptability under pressure. They had learned the hard way how to keep fighting when conditions were ugly, when plans fell apart, when vehicles broke, when the situation changed overnight. That kind of mental toughness doesn't stay in one environment. It becomes part of the unit. Looking back, the fear the Desert Rats inspired tells you something bigger about how military reputations are actually built. Not on paper, not on equipment lists, not on slogans. The 7th Armored Division wasn't always the best supplied. They didn't always have the newest tanks. They weren't the largest formation on the battlefield, and they didn't have a perfect record. But they developed 3 things that mattered more than perfect conditions ever could. First, they mastered their environment by learning the desert's reality instead of pretending it was Europe. Second, they built tactics that matched that environment, mobile, flexible, and hard to predict. Third, they forged a culture that resisted collapse, so defeats didn't end them, retreats didn't humiliate them into quitting, and losses didn't erase their identity. To German soldiers, that combination felt like facing an enemy that had the desert itself on their side. And maybe that's the truest reason the Desert Rats were feared. Not because they were supernatural, not because they had better everything, but because they were always present, always watching, always coming back. In a landscape that punished weakness and rewarded experience, the Desert Rats became the unit that seemed to belong there. The Germans were skilled, aggressive, and dangerous, but they never fully owned the desert the way the Desert Rats did. The red rat patch became a kind of warning. You can bring tanks, guns, and confident plans into North Africa, but if you don't understand the place you're fighting in, a unit like the 7th Armored Division will turn that ignorance into your downfall. And in war, there's no compliment more brutal than this. The enemy remembers you, not as a rumor, not as propaganda, but as a real problem they never solved. That's what the desert rats became in North Africa, an idea forged in heat, dust, and distance. An enemy the Afrika Korps couldn't simply break, and a unit whose reputation was earned the hardest way possible, by surviving long enough to make even Europe's conquerors admit, quietly and painfully, that the desert belonged to the rats.